10:10 a.m., June 19, 1944, Combat Information Center, USS Lexington, CV-16. The room is cool and dim, the only air-conditioned space at sea, smelling faintly of waxed deck and hot dust. Headsets hiss with clipped call signs. Ensign Sparks O'Rourke steadies a coffee mug with one hand and traces a new arc on the plexiglass plot with the other, bearing 290, Angels 20. The SK set has been walking contacts in from the western horizon. Now the blips resolve into 4s and 6s. On the 1MC, a voice cuts through the ship's heartbeat with the kind of calm that makes men breathe slower. Fighting 2, Vector 290, Angels 20, Bogies 150 miles, fast. O'Rourke's talker relays the line down the voice tube. A plotter updates grease pencil bearings. The evaluator nods once. This is the choreography of the new war. Radar eyes, CIC brains, pilots as the reaching hand. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher has built the day's plan around big cap and early intercepts. Admiral Raymond Spruance's order is simpler. Protect Operation Forager first, kill what comes. On the flight deck, Yellow Shirt's gesture, and the smell of 115/145 Avgas drifts like a bright idea into the wind. A plane captain slaps the cowling of an F6F-3. Pratt and Whitney R2800 idling at a bass rumble that vibrates in the bones. 6 Browning .5s are green, safety's in. The fighters climb for their barrier stations, altitude blocks that will catch the raid long before any Judy can fold into a dive or any Jill can settle into a torpedo run. The board grows busy. Additional returns pop from the south, perhaps a second strike moving to merge. O'Rourke would have licked a thumb and wiped the edge of a line flat. The habit never leaves. Confirm raid size, he asks. 60 plus, comes back, cautious, because claims and counts go slippery under stress. It is enough. On flag bridges across Task Force 58, carrier groups 58.1 through 58.4, the tone is restrained. Doctrine says intercept far, shoot fast, leave shipboard guns for leakers. The 5/38 directors slew anyway because sailors trust steel. In the oil-slick heat of the Philippine Sea, the water runs flat as hammered tin. Over Saipan, Marines fight. Here, the fight will be decided at ranges no one can see. Fighting 2, cleared to pounce, O'Rourke says, emplacing the check mark that means fighters are in. Throttles go to the stop. Somewhere above the weather, a pilot grins into his oxygen mask and rolls inverted, the sun becoming a blade in his canopy. The board's chalked arcs lean west, and with them leans the hinge of a navy's fate. On the other side of the ocean's glint, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet breathes to life. Flight decks tremble as a 6M50s, D4Y Judy dive bombers, and B6N Jill torpedo bombers trundle forward, wings cocked like gulls. Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura, a strike leader who has outlived too many wingmen, watches his undertrained pilots buckle in. The plan is Operation Ago, the decisive battle by range. Carrier aircraft will launch at long distance, strike, and, if fuel runs tight, recover on Guam. Nakamura checks his kneeboard. The A6M5 will climb briskly, nimble as ever, but the armour that might save a new pilot from a lucky .50 is still absent. The D4Y is fast for a dive bomber, the B6N steady in the torpedo role, but neither likes punishment. Doctrine assumes that spirit and formation discipline will carry the day. The great carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, roll and heave. Light carriers range alongside. Deck gangs run with chocks. Signal flags snap. The men are competent. The machines, elegant. The assumptions, old. He has been told American carriers cannot both cover the Saipan landings and rush to meet a long-range strike. He has heard rumours of new fuses, but rumours are wind. "We will approach under cloud," he says into the throat mic. Typical. The Zero does not need armour if the enemy never gets position. Ordnance crews load 250-kilogram bombs and Type 91 torpedoes. Fuel is set for a lean climb, a long cruise, and an alternate at Orote. They form on heading, droning toward a rectangle of sea marked on maps as enemy. Guam is a comforting word in the briefed plan, a mat laid out at the end of the high wire. If the strike runs long, Orote's strip will be there. That promise settles the stomach. Nakamura looks left. His wingman, barely out of the training pipeline that used to take years, returns a nervous waggle that could mean anything. He notes the cloud layers, the sun's angle, the way glare can hide a bounce. He files the details because details keep men alive. What he cannot see is the American plot board placing invisible hands in his path. He cannot hear the calm voices arranging altitude and sun, timing slashing runs. He believes range equals safety. He believes surprise still exists in a sky wired with electrons. These are not foolish beliefs, they are simply yesterdays. Guam flashes in his imagination again, a runway like a silver tongue lapping the lagoon. If need be, they will refuel there and strike again. The ocean is wide, their reach is longer. The truth is wider still. They are already being counted. Night shift whistle, Bethpage, Long Island. A foreman raises a hand and a new F6F slides like a blue-grey promise into daylight. Grumman's line runs at a pace that would have been mythic 3 years earlier. One Hellcat an hour at peak, a tempo that turns factory time into air superiority. On the flight decks of Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill and Hornet, men in yellow, blue and green shirts move as if tied to that metronome. The machine they tend is the bridge between a democracy's workshops and a pilot. The F6F 3 and 5 are blunt-nosed fighters wrapped around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a two-row radial that growls like a foundry. 6M2, Browning .50 caliber machine guns ride the wings, 400 rounds per gun typical for the day's load, giving a disciplined pilot the power to cut metal from sky. Self-sealing tanks, armour behind the seat, forgiving stall behaviour. Each detail is a promise to a 19 or 20-year-old who may have been pushing a broom in 1942 and is now pushing throttles through a Pacific dawn. On deck, plane captains chalk tyre pressures and wipe lenses. Ordnance men snap metal links into belts, the clatter familiar as prayer. A petty officer would have reminded a new man that long bursts are waste. Short, stitched taps at convergence do the work. The fighter is not beautiful like the Zero, but beauty is for posters. The Hellcat is built to come home with holes in it and to carry the rookie who will become a veteran in a single sortie. Gauges quiver at run-up, radios crackle with checks, the smell of hot oil and cordite rides the slipstream. Here is the impossible statistic modern readers blink at. In 1944 alone, the United States will build roughly 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan produces in the entire war. That is not chest-beating, it is arithmetic that bends strategy. It means Vice Admiral Mitcher can plan for Big Cap all morning and still have a deep magazine tomorrow. It means that when Admiral Spruant says protect Forager first, he is backed by a nation that can turn steel and fuel and labour into choices. The sea that morning is bright tin. The CICs are ready. On Guam, tankers idle. And at Bethpage, a riveter blows away aluminium curls from a fresh panel and thinks about coffee. He would not know the names on the day's flight schedule, but a straight seam here will keep a kid alive there. The factory clock ticks. A launch officer's whistle somewhere far away answers. Steele is about to think. At 10:20 a.m., the board edges from tense to inevitable. Raid 1 now 150 miles, O'Rourke calls, and the plot grows teeth. Cap stations flex like muscles. One division holds high at Angels 25 to bounce, another drifts lower to scissor the separation between escorts and bombers. The geometry would have been taught in chalk and sweat. Never meet a formation head-on when sun and altitude can be spent like money. The sky is a chessboard. The pieces move by radio and trust. The first tally comes in bursts. Tally many, Judy's ahead, Jill's low starboard, pressing. Oxygen masks flatten vowels. Excitement hides under brevity. The F6Fs dive out of the sun as if an invisible hand has tipped the sky. A Judy blossoms into orange petals and disappears. A second Jinx tries to roll into its pushover and meets .50 caliber tracers that look to the shooter like white-hot sewing needles. A Jill holds steady for a torpedo run that will never begin. The escorts are late or already tangled in a fight they did not choose. Shipboard guns keep their temper. The 5/38 directors track, waiting for leakers, while 40 seconds and 20 seconds chatter a warning. Doctrine works when the people do. The CIC talks in vectors and angels. The pilots answer in bursts and breaks. Somewhere, a young American would have overled and walked fire across an empty patch of sky, learning in real time that economy of ammunition is survival. Somewhere else, a Zero pilot watches a Hellcat shrug into a shallow dive it should not be able to hold and understands that strength can be a tactic. Claims begin to stack. They will be messy. Multiple shooters on the same burning shape, the geometry of speed lying to honest eyes. But the trend is clear. The carriers steam on untouched. A single bomb will later scar battleship South Dakota. For now, the decks move only with wind and intention. Over Saipan, the Marines fight among cane fields and coral. Out here, the battle is being won in contrails and radio checks, in the precise cadence of voices calling angels and vectors as if reading a liturgy. Nakamura's formation feels the first subtraction. A wingman fails to answer. A Judy falls without a parachute. The horizon seems to absorb airplanes. He orders a descent to stay under the sun, the correctness of a textbook clashing with a sky that is suddenly all angles and no mercy. If they press, they are meat. If they turn, they are prey. He keeps going. Guam exists, he reminds himself. Guam is a promise made by men he respects. Raid 1 broken, a controller says, dry as a ledger entry. O'Rourke erases a triangle and adds 2 new arrows forming up beyond the wreckage. The sea stays flat, bright and ignorant. It is not yet noon, and the war for the day has the feel of something already decided, by machines, yes, but more by the people who learned how to make machines a plan. Alexander Vratsiu slides behind a gaggle of D4Y Judies that sparkle like coins in a fountain. He is VF-16, USS Lexington, and the gun sight ring seems suddenly generous. Tally 6, he might have said over the net or kept it to himself. He picks the trailer first because the trailer teaches the rest. Short burst, tap, tap, tap. The nose of the Judy lifts away as if surprised. A bomb falls free and tumbles alone. He is already rolling for the next. The Hellcat is a brutal teacher, kind to the hand that listens. 6 M2s with typical loads around 400 rounds per gun means a pilot who wastes bursts will be empty in minutes. Vratsiu fires in licks, 3 seconds at most, walking the tracers through engine and cockpit and wing route. Convergence is set where the bullets cross, a few hundred yards ahead. The sight picture is muscle memory learned from instructors who insisted the difference between spray and stitch was life. The second Judy kites, then stiffens into a falling leaf. The third tries a break he has seen before. The F6F's dive strength and elevator authority make a liar of it. He clears his 6 reflexively, a habit beaten in by instructors who had seen too many good men surprised. Below, the ocean is freckled with the day's decisions. Above, the radios blur into a single voice that is not a man, but a mood. Press, press, break right, nice shooting, check high 3. It would have sounded like home to a farm kid and like destiny to an engineer. Vratsiu's feet dance on the rudder. The 4th D4Y loses lift in a sudden unzippering of metal. He moves to the fifth with the cool of someone who has been both scared and saved before, noting fuel state and sun angle as if reciting a catechism. 6 in 8 minutes, 360 rounds expended. The arithmetic is dry. The reality is wet palms and a neck that aches from swivelling. He breathes out through the mask and tastes rubber and cordite. He looks for the escorts and finds only lonely zeros, late to a funeral. Down low, a stick of Jill's that should have been the day's danger wallows without courage or cover. Doctrine predicted escorts would tie up the CAP. Radar and timing answered doctrine with subtraction. When the deck photo is taken later, he will grin, hold up 6 fingers, and look like a poster. But the truth that should be remembered is uglier and finer. Discipline and a forgiving machine put a young man inside the kind of performance that legend mistakes for luck. He checks fuel and ammunition and notes, without romance, that the ocean is wide and the work is not done. Bingo checks, someone says. The sky smells faintly of burned lacquer. Far to the west, the plot is already laying down the next line. The runway at a rota field looks like Mercy from 10 miles out, a silver strip cutting the palms. Japanese flight leaders call the pattern with the brittle formality of men who believe they have outrun bad luck. Fuel gauges show needles that would have worried a peacetime instructor. The promise of the shuttle, launch from carriers, recover on Guam, glows like a lantern at the end of a cave. Then the lantern begins to flicker. Hellcats circle above the island like indifferent hawks. They have been vectored here by controllers who read the morning's geometry and saw a place to turn doctrine inside out. Strike groups expecting sanctuary will be naked, slow, and focused on descent. It is unkind, and it is war. Luz Santos, a Chamorro radio operator, would later recall the tone of the tower's voice as clearance lights blinked and tracer wires fell across the approach like invisible fences. She smells hot dust and spilled gasoline. The air trembles with engine heat. The palms shiver in invisible wakes. A D4Y slides down final, flaps out, pilot fixated on centerline. An F6F cuts through the glide path and opens with a short stitch from 6 o'clock high. The Judy staggers and slews across the coral. A B6N tries to force the issue, engine coughing. It meets the same refusal. The pattern becomes a wheel of smoke. On another day, the CAP would have guarded only the task force. Today, the system flexes, and the sea's edge moves to Guam. Range, the boast of Ago, has become a fatal length of rope. Here, the impossible statistic is not a single number, but a comparison that feels like fiction. In the late morning window, roughly 10:20 to 12:30, Japanese carrier air power suffers losses that some air forces would not replace in a year, while the Americans will, the next day, launch more aircraft than Ozawa has left after the 19th. And though it will come a day later, remember the measure of abundance. When Mitcher turns on the lights on the 20th to save his aviators and loses around 80 aircraft to darkness and fuel, he still commands a striking arm larger than the enemy's surviving force. Nakamura drops a notch of flaps, heartbeat loud in the headset. He would have told himself to keep the checklist cadence, to fly the airplane, to land. He sees a Hellcat flash past and realizes the runway is not a promise but a lure. He adds power, retracts, and rolls for the open sea, choosing survival over orders. Luz hears his call sign once, then static. The lantern goes dark. The island smells of burned rubber and salt. Over the water, the sky keeps its secrets and the system keeps score. The first time a leaker threads the CAP, the fleet remembers it is not helpless. Directors swing, pointers call deflection, and the 5-inch mounts begin their metronome. The sound is layered, the slow, percussive boom of 5/38 dual-purpose guns. The urgent chatter of 40mm Bofors walking bursts ahead of a speck. The sewing machine rip of 20mm Oerlikons tracing arcs you could almost touch. In the CIC, O'Rourke marks a fresh track with a small deliberate cross and says, almost conversationally, "Leaker, low, starboard." On a deck crowded with men who prefer certainty, the order is simplicity itself. Shoot. Proximity fuses do what rumour could not explain. Instead of praying for contact, gunners see shells blossom into timed suns near a diving silhouette, the near misses that used to be useless, now flensing aluminum. A D4Y presses its nerve through cotton puffs, then pauses as if pushed, lifting a wing and vanishing into a descending signature of smoke. Another attacker skates along the edge of the barrage and slices low, so low that spray mists its canopy. A wall of 40mm fire meets it at the trolley line of the wake, and the airplane becomes an argument already lost. One bomb finds the battleship South Dakota. The hit slams her like the deck has stumbled. Paint scorches, a compartment fills with smoke, and damage control teams turn into the wind with hoses and discipline. She steadies, steam unfazed, crew acting from practice that would have saved a ship 10 times over. The carriers, the day's true targets, remain untouched. Men will joke later that the gunners never got their money's worth, but every steady hand on a trainer wheel and every crisp range call helped make sure the CAP fought free, unharried by the thunder of their own side. On the radio, pilots count kills. On the bridge, captains count minutes. The doctrine that began the morning in chalk survives contact. Intercept far, kill early, let the guns reap the rest. A Jill tries for a straight-line courage run and dies precisely because it is straight. A Zero tests a masthead swerve and finds there is no safe seam in a formation whose geometry has been rehearsed since Norfolk. If you stood along a catwalk, you would have smelled cordite and hot brass, the odd sweetness of burned lacquer drifting downwind. You would have seen spent shell cases roll and clink at your feet like coins. You would have felt the ship shake, decide, and carry on. O'Rourke erases one cross and draws another farther out. Raid 2 fragmenting, he says, and his tone is as mild as if he were reading noon position. The sea keeps its shine, the plan keeps its promises. By the next afternoon, the ocean wears a different light, long, late, burnished. Mitcher studies a map that is also a clock and orders a strike that steps past caution. Helldivers and Avengers heave down the deck, wings shouldered against the last warmth of day, and Hellcat escorts lift into an evening that smells like hot metal and ambition. The range is long enough to make pilots count minutes instead of miles. Fuel tight, someone notes on a kneeboard, and the words ride along like an unwelcome passenger. The strike finds its marks. Hio takes the worst of it, torpedoes catching rhythm with a ship's heartbeat, until the heartbeat stops. Escorts get clawed and scalded. Somewhere in the melee, an American gunner feels the peculiar satisfaction of a steady lead and the equally peculiar grief of watching men walk along a deck that is no longer a deck. The sun drops like a coin into a slot. The return leg becomes arithmetic in the dark. Pilots talk to themselves when fuel needles fall below hope. They would have flicked unwanted switches to off just to pretend weight could lift away. One by one, voices call distance to the fleet and then the distance to empty. Doctrine says blacked out ships in submarine waters. Conscience says names and faces. Mitcher chooses both the risk and the men. Turn on the lights. It is as audacious as launching in the first place. A decision that makes every submarine in the Philippine Sea feel invited, and every returning aviator feel found. A city blooms on water, searchlights spear the cloud base, signal lamps wink a path, destroyers throw star-shell ladders into the sky. Deck crews line edges with flashlights that look small and then look like salvation. Anxious LSO paddles waggle in widening arcs, men in white jerseys leaning into the night as if their bodies could shorten the glide. Landings come crooked and hot, wheels catching arresting wires by grace as much as geometry. Some go into the water, dark splashes followed by lighter splashes, rafts, flares, faith. Losses mount in a different arithmetic now, around 80 aircraft written off to darkness, fuel, and the stubborn physics of fatigue. Yet the ratio that mattered to the Navy held: machines were spent so that people were not. Destroyers prowl astern, fishing pilots out with boat hooks and jokes they will remember long after the taste of seawater fades. On the flag bridge, a man who has gambled the silhouette of a fleet stares at a horizon that keeps producing wings. By first light, the decks look like work again. Oil mopped, cables reset, crews yawning with relief. The ocean betrays nothing of the gamble it swallowed. The enemy, what is left of him, will learn at dawn what decisions look like when a nation can afford to make them. When the staff in Ozawa's flag plot scratch approximately 35 operational aircraft into the log for the evening of June 19th, the script looks tidy enough to pass for normal. It is not normal. It is a verdict. 2 days in the Philippine Sea have consumed more than 1,000 Japanese aircraft, carrier and land-based together, while the Americans count roughly 123 lost, most of those to the night itself on the 20th. Ratios flatter no one in a cockpit, but they do instruct admirals and nations. The decisive fact is not that the losses were lopsided, it is that only one side can refill the board. A Bethpage riveter puts down a gun to flex her fingers and wipes aluminum dust from her cheekbone. Somewhere else, a Navy logistics officer circles numbers in a ledger. Replacement air groups ready to rotate, spare engines stacked like cordwood, propellers crated in rows that look like harvest. The Hellcat total will crest at roughly 12,275. At peak, the line has given the Navy a fighter every hour, a tempo that makes the impossible sound like office routine. In 1944 alone, the United States will build about 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan will produce in the entire war, an equation that could be printed on a poster and hung over a map of the Marianas without a single boastful adjective. Carriers under construction tell a parallel story. In 1943, the US could count scores of flat-tops building, fleet and escort, while Japan's shipyards nursed a handful. Even if Ozawa had sailed home with intact decks, the air groups to fill them were gone, their training pipeline throttled by fuel scarcity, attrition, and time itself. By contrast, American training syllabi grind on like seasons, turning civilians into aviators at a rate that feels like invention and is only administration well supplied. On Guam, Los Santos walks past a row of scorched patches where airplanes tried to become survivors and became lessons. On Lexington, Vratu stares at a night sky that still smells of flares and thinks about the rifles he will never clean, the fields he will not plough again, because the war keeps moving and he has become a man inside a system. O'Rourke rests a palm on the plexiglass plot and feels the cool promise of another morning with the same numbers behind it. Here is the impossible statistic rule fulfilled without flourish. One nation, in 1 year, outbuilds its enemy's entire war. One factory line, at a peacetime commute from Manhattan, outpaces an empire. In that arithmetic lives the answer to why a 2-hour window on June 19th became an ending. Numbers can lie in the moment, over months they teach. The lesson is that industrial democracy is a weapon, and it had been loaded long before the first vector call went out. Strip the legend without diminishing the courage. The core of June 19th is a late morning window in which a defensive system performs exactly as designed and erases an attacking air arm before it can become an attack. Between roughly 10:20 and 12:30, 4 raid streams find not a fleet but a plan: radar detection at long range, combat information centres stacking cap by altitude and sun, Hellcats slashing in disciplined passes, and shipboard AA waiting to complete the work. The carriers never present themselves as targets because the battle is won outside the weapons envelopes that once defined naval air combat. Pilots claimed lavishly that day, as pilots always do when the sky is a tangle and burning aircraft draw honest eyes to the same kill. American aviators would file claims approaching 380, the bulk to Hellcats, while the verified Japanese carrier losses for the day settle nearer 346, with shipboard guns contributing to the tally. The discrepancy is not deceit. It is physics and perception colliding at 300 knots. What matters is not the inflation, but the convergence. Whether by pilot or by prox-fused shell, the enemy did not find the decks he sought. CICs become the unlikely heroes modern readers rarely picture. A dim room, a cool breeze, men with pencils and patience moving squadrons like chessmen. If an airborne controller described the fight from the sky, the CIC officer would have described it from the future, calling vectors that set traps 3 minutes ahead. Radar becomes not a gadget but a doctrine, and the doctrine makes courage efficient. A rookie in an F6F can fight like a veteran when he starts high, with the sun at his back, with an intercept planned to disgorge him into the enemy at the moment the enemy is thinking about something else. Nakamura's story shrinks to the size of a fuel gauge and expands to the size of a lost tradition. His certainty that range and élan would thread him between dangers proves to be a map from 1942 held up against a coastline that 1944 has redrawn. When his surviving pilots look down at Guam and see tracer weirs closing the pattern, they are not witnessing treachery. They are witnessing a system allowed to reach across an island because it was supplied to do so. By early afternoon, the sea looks unchanged to a careless eye, no wrecks on the surface, no shattered decks. Yet the carrier war has tilted. The 2-hour war is not a misnomer. It is an admission that modern battle can be decided by the people who arrive first with information and enough airplanes. 4 months later, the Pacific writes its footnote to June in letters large enough for map makers. At Leyte Gulf, Ozawa sails north with carriers whose decks are more stage than spear, drawing Admiral Halsey away from the landing beaches with a promise he cannot afford to ignore. The Northern Force launches what it can, props bite air, wheels leave wood. Yet what rises is pageantry compared to 1942, handfuls of aircraft where there should have been waves. The Sunday punch of a navy that once measured itself by sortie counts has become a feint. On American flag bridges, the planners do not gloat, they plan. The confidence to leave amphibious shipping covered while striking far is born of ratios learned the hard way and sustained by maintenance schedules and fuel states that look like abundance. Task Force 38 can put up enough combat air patrol and still send strikes outward because the factories have already written those sorties into future ledgers. If a Hellcat prangs a landing, there is another on the hangar deck. If a pilot must ditch, destroyers turn towards spray with boat hooks out and coffee hot. Japanese staff officers do not miss the meaning. They were not fools in June and they are not fools in October. They are men caught in a narrowing hallway. Training pipelines shortened by necessity produce wings, but not judgment. Fuel rationing turns syllabi into notebooks of good intentions. Airframes built with elegance cannot disguise the truth that losses measured by the day cannot be replaced by the month. When the Northern Force is found and struck, carriers go down as symbols more than as weapons. The pilots who do not launch stand on quiet decks and listen to the sea say what their logbooks already know. On Saipan and Guam, civilians who learned to name aircraft by sound hear a different emptiness. Where there should have been the long roar of a massed strike, there are occasional engines, lonely riches spent on a gamble that has already been called. If wartime rumour searches for villains, history finds arithmetic. The Philippine Sea did not make Leyte Gulf inevitable, but it did make one outcome more likely than all the rest. Carriers without air groups, admirals with intentions larger than their means, a navy that could move men and steel, but not the odds. Aboard American carriers, boys who grew into aviators between chalk talks and combat briefings check their harnesses like habit. Aboard Japanese carriers, men check tie-downs that will hold aircraft still long enough for the enemy to see them. The decoy works for a while. The lesson travels farther. After the shooting stops for the night, a rescued pilot sits under hangar lights with a blanket around his shoulders and a paper cup of coffee warming his hands. He stares past the cup at the wreckage parked in neat rows, wings folded like broken promises, and knows in his bones he is part of a calculus that offends no one aboard. Spend machines to save people. Mitchell's "Turn on the lights" is more than an order. It is a thesis about what a democracy armed with factories can afford to risk for names and faces. The legacy of those 2 days runs beyond photographs of burning carriers and smiling aces. Radar rooms become the ancestors of airborne warning and control. Grease pencils evolve into displays that make entire skies legible. The Combat Information Center, cool, dim and anonymous, turns into a doctrine of command and control that will guide air battles for generations. Training pipelines that once looked extravagant become the standard. Cross-trained sailors who could fuel, arm and patch airplanes under moonlight become the model for a military that values adaptability as much as obedience. It is tempting to shave numbers into slogans, but the numbers are the point. In 1944, the United States built about 96,000 aircraft, a figure that exceeds Japan's entire wartime total. Grumman alone turned out 12,000 plus Hellcats at peak tempo, roughly 1 per hour. Those statistics, which sound like boasts until you set them beside maps, explain why a fleet could illuminate itself at night, lose around 80 aircraft to recover its men, and still fly a bigger deck load at dawn than its enemy could muster by the week. They also explain gentler phenomena. Candy bars tossed to drenched aircrew, hot coffee everywhere, spare parts that seem to grow from bulkheads. Nakamura would have stood on a quay months later and watched ships that once frightened oceans make their last quiet turns. O'Rourke would have told a new ensign why calm voices matter. Luz Santos would have learned to sleep through engines that no longer meant danger. Vratsiu would shake hands with riveters who never smelled salt air and mean every word he found. None of them needs a historian to add superlatives. They need only the record, dates, vectors, calibers, and a decision that a nation made before it ever reached the Philippine Sea, that industrial democracy, properly led, could turn metal into mercy as well as victory. The blanket rustles, the coffee goes cold. The deck crew drags a wreck aside to clear a path for morning. The lights stay on a moment longer than necessary, as if the ships are reluctant to forget the faces they saved.